I was appalled by New Earth, but things got back on track with Tooth and Claw. This is a great episode, effectively a slice of old-school Who Gothic horror with a faster pace. You can quibble over the effectiveness or otherwise of the whole "we are not amused" malarkey, but there's little else to complain about. It's pretty much the best episode of the season and one of Tennant's overall best stories. Tennant himself, who I hadn't really been impressed with in New Earth, particularly in that awful bit where he channels Kenneth Williams after being taken over by Cassandra, was much better here also. If Tooth and Claw had mollified me somewhat after the debacle that was New Earth, the following episode only increased my sense of growing dissatisfaction. School Reunion should have been a winner, and many in fandom still believe that it is, bringing back Sarah Jane Smith and K9 in a massive nostalgia fest that makes it 100% clear that fanfiction New Who is intended to be a continuation of the original series rather than some kind of reboot or remake. It's rather unfortunate, if that was indeed the intent, that they can completely undo this effort by retconning the character of Sarah Jane and doing so in such an utterly awful and ham-fisted manner. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not actually the biggest fan of Sarah anyway. I think she's wildly overrated and probably the worst companion of the 70s, to tell you the truth. But she certainly didn't deserve to be retconned from a strong independent woman, who, as K9 and company in the Five Doctors had made clear, had moved on from her travels and gotten on with her life quite happily, into a sad, bitter old biddy who, according to this episode, has spent the last 30 years pining for the Doctor's Willie, and this is done solely, for no other reason, than to poorly contrast her with Rose, who by this point has now clearly started doing the same thing. This episode bugged me for days before I finally came to the conclusion that it was, in fact, crap. The Girl in the Fireplace is next, and this is a very weird episode. On the one hand, it's an excellent slice of science fiction romance and a very good episode of television. On the other hand, it's a completely awful piece of televised Doctor Who fanfic that Stephen Moffat uses to essentially obliterate the character of the Doctor from the original series and replace him with someone else entirely. Moffat's retarded view of the Doctor had been hinted at in The Empty Child, but there it was played for comedy and not taken seriously. Here it's done for real, and suddenly the Doctor, an asexual intellectual explorer gentleman character in classic Who, suddenly becomes this pathetically lonely tortured romantic. It's easy to see the reasons for this, and the audience this stuff was aimed at, which it succeeded in drawing in, as did the nauseatingly ludicrous stuff with Rose all season. But none of this has anything to do with the actual real Doctor, and from this moment Tennant's incarnation is completely hamstrung with this shit, something which will also haunt Matt Smith's Doctor, and the damage from this crap may never be fully undone. The Rise of the Cybermen two-parter was next. The Daleks had been reintroduced to a modern audience with great success the previous season, so despite my growing misgivings I was very much looking forward to seeing a modern take on the Cybermen, who I actually always preferred to the Daleks in the original series. Sadly, this two-parter was a disaster from start to finish. Making the decision to have the Cybermen not actually be the Cybermen from the original series, but a sort of weird parallel universe version, was a colossal cock-up from which the new series version has never fully recovered, but the story itself is also an utter turkey. The first half is unbelievably boring and dull, with much of the narrative taken up yet again with Rose's daddy issues and a truly awe-inspiringly bad performance by Roger Lloyd-Pack as Not Davro's Honest. Keeping the monster revealed till the end of part 1 might work in classic Who, when in the end of part 1 is just 24 minutes and barely a quarter of the way through the story, but when part 1 is 45 minutes and the whole is only 90, that means you've wasted half the fucking story. Part 2 is mildly better, with a bit of action and some atmospheric moments in the tunnels, but the whole thing feels desperately contrived, and Tennant is also really poor in this. In the dinner party scenes in the first episode, he seems to practically disappear from the character of the Doctor altogether, and the scenes at the end where he confronts the cyber controller are also very weak. I was starting to have serious doubts not just about Series 2 but about Tennant's Doctor at this point, and those doubts only increased with the Idiot's Lantern. In some respects the Idiot's Lantern is better than Rise, with a spooky and fun central idea, but it's terribly directed and acted, and that includes by the regulars. Tennant and Piper are never more obnoxious than they are here, bursting into a home and patronizing and yelling at a man in his own home because he has the temerity to be from the 1950s and thus lucky enough not to be steeped in 21st century PC culture. Tennant is equally awful in the scene where he finds Rose without a face. His attempts at anger are woeful, and it speaks volumes, and not good ones, that the 10th Doctor only seems to really become bothered about the sinister goings-on when it affects his darling Rosebud. Vomit bags at the ready, people. The Satan Pit two-parter is one of the most popular stories of the era. Sadly, I can't share that enthusiasm, though in theory I probably should. It's a classic base under siege idea, with scary monsters and a brilliant production. Sadly, the script is a bit of a mess, and the Doctor's character is again brutally misunderstood. The lack of explanations as to the nature of the devil figure and the people that imprisoned him is not clever or mysterious, it's just plain lazy, the first episode setting up intriguing mysteries that episode 2 just completely fails to pay off. It's one thing to leave the characters wondering, as the girl in the fireplace did earlier in the season, but when the audience is left none the wiser as to what the hell that was all about, that's not a good thing. The idea that this beast might be the real devil is also ludicrous. Not only is such a notion utterly contrary to the science over superstition ethos that has always been part of the series' central makeup, but there's nothing to really suggest this either. This thing can possess people and is slightly telepathic. Big deal. There are innumerable more powerful entities in the original series, from the Celestial Toymaker to the Black Guardian to Sutekh the Destroyer, all of whom seem more deserving of the devil moniker than this useless thing. The idea of the Doctor even entertaining the notion is also absurd. I could just hear Tom Baker's Doctor ridiculing the very idea. It's one thing for the crew to buy into this crap because of their fear, but for the Doctor to do so is utterly out of character. Tennant is also awful in the end confrontation with the beast, mugging like it's going out of fashion in a way that will become standard toward the end of his tenure. There are some things to like in this story, but as a whole it's deeply unsatisfying, and the guest characters are also largely very uninteresting. Love and Monsters is next. One of the few episodes of New Who it seems okay, nay required to hate. I don't mind it actually. In fact, I find it rather entertaining and funny. Most of the hate directed at the episode seems to come from it, including a possible oral sex joke at the end, which pretty much tells you everything you need to know about Doctor Who fans right there. Fear Her is next and is almost equally unpopular. I don't much like it, but I don't really hate it, and there are a number of infinitely worse New Who stories that deserve to be lower on fan polls than this one. Like most of the last 3 seasons, for example. Tennant and Piper are actually pretty good here, both of them coming across as more likable and genuine than is often the case in this season. The Doomsday 2-part finale is next and sadly does not repeat the success of the first season's epic finale. In fact, this 2-parter is largely pretty terrible and pretty dull. Part of the problem is the direction. Graham Harper, once regarded as the greatest Who director of all time, delivers a surprisingly flat production that fails to generate any real atmosphere, even in the first episode where we're supposed to believe the Cybermen are ghosts. Of course, the Cybermen, or Cybusmen as I call these interlopers, get their season finale stolen by the Daleks. If there was ever any doubt that New Who is televised fanfiction, the likes of School Reunion and particularly this finale should put an end to them immediately. Daleks vs. Cybermen is an obvious fanfiction idea, such an obvious one that the classic series occasionally looked at it and then decided against ever doing it because it was clearly shit. And shit it turns out to be, turning the Cybusman into a complete joke. Not that the battle between these foes amounts to all that much anyway, with much of the running time of episode 2 dealing with Rose's family issues again, wake me when it's over as Colin once said, and Rose's departure. Yes, she leaves. Thank God. It's tragic really, as I rather liked Rose in Series 1, but in Series 2 she became a total, annoying Mary Sue royal pain in the ass, and together with Tennant, who is again thoroughly nondescript in the finale, a thoroughly punchable pair of smug gits. Her final scene is hilariously over the top. If you, she wails into Rue Mills and Boone fashion as teenage fangirls wept into their hankies and classic Who fans started weeping for a very different reason, namely the death of the character and program they waited 15 fucking years to come back for. Series 2 is a pretty awful season. It is easily the worst of the Davis era and one of the worst of all time, selling the character and the series completely down the river in a desperate bid to maintain the unexpected mainstream audience Series 1 had managed to grip without taking such desperate measures. Fortunately New Who would not be quite this bad again, at least for about 5 years anyway. I give Series 2 of fanfiction New Who a well-deserved F.